Hello, in this lesson, we're going to talk about intermediate punishments and parole. And to start with intermediate punishments, I have what I think is a great quote by Morris and Tonry, who wrote a book called Between Prison and Probation. And they say the criminal justice system is both too lenient and too severe. And I think that's spot on and speaks to a problem that they wrote the book in the 80s and that the corrections system has really been dealing with since then, trying to find intermediate punishments between prison and probation. Because oftentimes the criminal justice system can be very much too severe, and that people will go to prison for crimes where they don't really need to be locked away. They don't pose a real threat to the community. It's expensive to lock them up. It destroys their prospects for the most part. But at the same time, just normal probation just isn't punitive enough, right? Probation, you maybe see a probation officer a couple times a month. Maybe you have to pee in a cup a couple times a month. Maybe go into some treatment, do a few things, but that's about it. And so intermediate punishments try to fill that gap between just traditional probation, which can be a little too lenient for some crimes, but at the same time, putting people in prison for those crimes maybe seems a little too severe. So intermediate punishments are new punishment options developed to fill the gap between traditional probation and traditional jail or prison sentences, and to better match the severity of punishment to the seriousness of the crime. So to reiterate that the criminal justice system can be too severe and too lenient at the same time because we don't have a whole lot of options. Well, we can lock you up, which is pretty severe. And as we talked about earlier, it's kind of odd that's just sort of our go-to for so many crimes that you just go and you get locked up. But at the same time, probation oftentimes just feels too lenient for some of these crimes. So what else is there? Well, there's things like reintegration programs, so halfway houses, furloughs, work release programs. So again, a halfway house is partly a reintegration program. So it's for people coming out of prison. They serve the last 10%, say, of their sentence in a halfway house. They go, they have to get a job during the day. They come back, they have to spend the night at the halfway house. But also, it's a halfway in house. So it's also an intermediate punishment where, say, you're on probation, you're screwing up on probation. Again, prison might be a bit too extreme for your screwing up. Also, it's expensive, and sometimes there's just no room. And so something like a halfway house can be an intermediate punishment where, well, before we send you to prison, we're going to take you out of your own home and we're going to stick you in this halfway house. So that's somewhere in between prison and probation. So I'm on probation, I'm screwing around. Now I get sent to a halfway house where now I got to go and I got to stay there at night, but I don't lose my job. I can still go do my job. Maybe I have to go to drug treatment at night, anger counseling, that kind of thing. So that's the idea of what an intermediate punishment is. It's not quite prison, it's not quite probation. So furloughs are really reintegration programs too, where you're in prison, but you're allowed to leave during the day to go to work, similar to a work release program. So work release programs often are separate institutions where you go, you stay. Maybe it's a big dorm, it's minimum security, it's people who are about to be released. So it's similar to a halfway house, but it's still more of a prison environment. And but you still get to go to work during the day, then you have to return. So here's an example of a halfway house. They're also called residential community centers. Residential correction centers, community sanction centers, community correction centers. So it really, these acronyms kind of change as grant proposals change, as trends change, and that sort of thing. But so these would be rooms where a resident would come out of prison, or before going to prison, they'd have to spend the night here inside their room. During the day, they'd go off and get a job, work, and then maybe down here, there'd be drug counseling and that sort of thing in the evening before they have to go back to their rooms. And then there's day reporting centers, which I think are great. And these are sort of the opposite of a halfway house. So a halfway house, you go out and work during the day and you have to come and spend the night at the halfway house. A day reporting center is the opposite of that, right? And remember, this is how Cook County partly how they reduced their overcrowding problem at the jail was they sent more people to day reporting centers. So this is, you spend the night at your own home, but during the day you have to come by and you have to check in every day. And maybe you have to go to counseling that day. Maybe you have to pee in a cup that day. Maybe you have to talk to, again, go to some sort of therapy for conflict management, anger resolution, that sort of thing. So it's kind of the opposite of a halfway house, and it's great because it's really cheap, because the expense is housing them overnight and all the security and all those issues. Here, they just have to come, and maybe they have to spend 2 hours. Maybe they only have to spend 30 minutes. Maybe they have to spend 4 hours, and they have to come here and they check in. So you would tack this on with probation. So again, it's an intermediate punishment where probation by itself just isn't enough. Prison's too much. But if you include a day reporting center where somebody has to report every day for an hour, has to go in and get a drug test, has to go in and do these different things, then that increases the punitiveness, but it also increases the ability to intervene with their problems. Community service. So this is where offenders basically go out and do community service. It's also a way for offenders who can't afford to pay fines, right? So if I can't afford to pay my fine, I go to jail. So a jurisdiction that's fining somebody not only isn't getting paid the fine, now they have to pay to incarcerate that individual in a jail. So it's helpful then if instead they can go and work that off. And so they go and you figure out, well, what would it take to pay somebody minimum wage to go collect trash for 7 hours a day? You make them go do it, and that's how they pay off their fine, is through work. So you can do all kinds of things, right? Trash pickup. I remember when I worked at the juvenile drug court for testing positive, sometimes the kids would have to go do additional community service at like Goodwill. So they'd have to go and they'd have to spend the night folding clothes and organizing clothes for Goodwill. And it's strange. Community service is a weird punishment because, of course, UIndy is education for service. Service is a good. It's something we should all want to do. We should all find it intrinsically valuable. It's good for the community. And so some people say that it should never be a punishment because it puts community service in the wrong light. It treats community service as a bad thing that's used as a punishment, when in fact it's an uplifting thing that's good. On the other hand, they have found that when offenders do community service, if they find it valuable, they actually will have lower levels of recidivism. If offenders do community service and they find it punishing and they feel that it's useless, they will actually have higher rates of recidivism. So there's a lot of interesting potential for community service based in strengths-based rehabilitation programs and all this that are really interesting, but it's all really complicated. And right now, basically, we just make them go do stuff without a whole lot of thought into the theory behind it or how the mechanisms of it could actually improve behavior. Of course, electronic monitoring is a big thing. So this is GPS monitoring. Our technology is definitely moving along at quite a clip, so that it used to be you'd have this ankle monitor and the probation or parole officer would call, and you had to have this thing on your phone, and then you had to attach it to your ankle, and that way it would know that you were there within your house. Now, of course, GPS just knows if you're in a house or within 100 feet of a place you're not supposed to be. And, there's ways that they can monitor now in your sweat. If you've used drugs or drink alcohol, it can detect that. So the sophistication is really, it's a little bit spooky. So someday, offenders, I have no doubt, will have microchips placed under their skin that will monitor for drugs, that will monitor where they are, but also will monitor to see that they are taking drugs, right? So one of the big problems with a lot of mentally ill offenders is when they leave, they stop taking their medications. So you could actually have microchips under the skin that not only we're testing to make sure that people aren't using drugs they're not supposed to be using, but you could also ensure that they are using drugs that they are supposed to be using. So that's kind of interesting. It's both interesting and fascinating, and also it's a little bit creepy. So boot camps were a big thing in the 90s, and this would be oftentimes for first-time young offenders where they would have to go somewhere that basically mimicked a military boot camp. So they have to go somewhere for 3 months, 4 months, and go through basically boot camp, a lot of physical training, a lot of discipline, right? Making your bed just so, and all that. And they were super popular. People loved them, right? They appear tough on crime. Uh, People really believe that militaristic experiences can change lives, and certainly they do. More importantly, is it's a more economical alternative to incarceration, right? So those are some of the real benefits. They don't reduce recidivism. So study after study has failed to show any effectiveness at reducing recidivism, such that now they're often not even called boot camps anymore. So boot camps got kind of a bad name for just that reason. They became so popular, kind of like Scared Straight. For some reason, some of these things just really resonate with the public, but they don't work at all, right? Scared Straight used to be around in the 70s, and people realized it didn't work. So they got rid of it, and then it came back, and I think it was like a TV show. Some of these things just people like, but the evidence just consistently shows they don't work. So boot camps now are often called shock incarceration. And the real benefit to a boot camp or to shock incarceration is that it's cheaper, right? And so why lock somebody? And it's short; it can be shorter, but experienced is just as punitive by the individual going through it. So why send somebody to jail for 9 months or prison for a year if you can send them to a boot camp for 120 days? They experience it as just as punitive. They're not isolated from the community as long, and it's way cheaper for us than to lock them up. So even if the recidivism rates were the exact same, if locking someone away for 6 months or putting someone in a boot camp for 4 months, it turned out they both have a 30% chance of committing another offense. Well, then opt for the boot camp because it's going to be much cheaper, um, with the exact same outcome. So again, as we've talked about, recidivism isn't the only outcome. If you're not seeing an increase in recidivism, savings is an excellent outcome to achieve. And here's an example. This is a little dated, but this is a great table that I swiped from somewhere. And of course, it always varies based on location, but you can just see the difference in costs, where a prison obviously is the most expensive, and even a halfway house is almost half price of a prison, but those are still really expensive. And then you get down to uh, day reporting centers. Look how cheap that is. So if you can take somebody out of jail where you're paying $21,000 a year to keep them in jail, and instead you put them and require that they go to a day reporting center for just $2,800, and they got to go every day, and they're in the community and they can maintain employment. That seems like a great deal. Even the remote location monitoring, right? Even intensive parole supervision, which is where the parole officer has a much smaller caseload, checks up on them a lot more, goes to their home a lot, goes to their place of work a lot. That's, again, considerably cheaper than incarceration. So, one problem that these intermediate punishments raise is this idea of net widening. And so, with net widening, what you do is you end up placing offenders into programs who otherwise wouldn't have been in a program. So, a lot of offenders, they're found guilty of something and that's it, they're just released. Or they're found guilty and they're put on regular probation. And so when you develop these new intermediate programs, what they do is they end up where they would have just been on probation. Now they're on probation, plus they're doing community service, plus they got to go to a day reporting center, plus they got to go to drug treatment. And so every time you add this additional thing, you're adding cost to the criminal justice system. And then you're also putting more and more demands on the offender, which then increases the odds that they're going to fail. And so you are expanding the net to encompass people who otherwise wouldn't have been in the program. And when you combine that with this idea of cherry picking, where you develop a new program, success for your program is measured on recidivism rates. You're going to try to get the offenders who are the least risky, right? Who are the most likely to succeed. Well, those are the ones who don't need the help. And so you end up putting more and more people who have less and less problems into more and more programs. And so you're widening the criminal justice net, right? So instead of placing these marginal offenders, right, the ones who are sort of risky, where again, prison's a bit much, but probation's not enough, that's who it's for. Instead of that, you end up widening the net to encompass the least serious offender who really is best off just on regular probation, if anything at all, and you end up sucking them in. And so the number of people under criminal justice surveillance just grows and grows and grows, right? When in fact, sometimes for some offenders, the best policy is maybe just to do nothing at all. Fines are one of the oldest forms of punishment. As we talked about earlier, a lot of the ancient legal codes were fines. They were fining systems, and in fact, there's evidence that the Hammurabi Code was actually a fine system, and that the interpretation wasn't an eye for an eye, but the value of an eye for an eye, and it actually established fines. So they've been around for a really long time. They're generally used for misdemeanors, for traffic offenses, ordinance violations, that sort of thing. In the US, they're primarily used for traffic offenses and less serious, sort of high volume misdemeanors where you just got people coming through court. They get a citation, they get a fine, they move on. And they are actually the most frequently used sanction in the US. So when we think about corrections, again, we always think about prisons and jails, and then sometimes we'll think about probation and parole. But in terms of actual frequency, fines are the most utilized punishments. In fact, most of you have probably been fined at some point. Other countries use fines for more serious crimes beyond just misdemeanors and traffic offenses. Also, in the US, fines are fixed or tariff. That is, it's the same fine for the same offense. So, whoever you are, if you're going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, it's a set fine for that offense. However, there are other countries that link the fine amount to the offender's ability to pay, so that if you make more money, your fine will cost more. And the idea is that's more fair, because if you were to give, say, somebody who makes $20,000 a year, you give them a $100 traffic ticket versus somebody who makes $250,000 a year, you give them a $100 traffic ticket. That's nothing. They wouldn't feel that at all. Whereas the person making $20,000 a year, that could really mess with their monthly budget to have to pay that. And so the day fine is a way of trying to affix the fine to someone's ability to pay to make it more fair. And so the day fine is where the financial penalty is scaled both to the seriousness of the crime and then also to the defendant's ability to pay. So it's used quite heavily in Europe, in Northern and Western Europe. And it's been really effective in reducing incarceration for some countries like Germany. There is little research on whether or not it reduces recidivism. But you remember, there's a lot of outcomes that corrections can achieve. Recidivism is just one of them. So a day fine breaks the financial penalty into two components. So there's the fine amount is based on the severity of the offense. So the more severe the offense, the more, say, number of work days worth of pay you'll have to pay out. But beyond that, the fine is then adjusted to how much money you make. So it's based on both the severity of the offense. So the more severe the offense, the more you'll have to pay. And then it's adjusted to your income. So a fine amount can first be established in increments of days, right? So the least serious offense would just be 5 days worth of fines, all the way up to the most serious offense, something like aggravated assault. would be 720 days, right? That's a couple of years worth of fines. And then, so that's how they establish the fine in terms of the severity of the offense. But then to scale it to income, ability to pay, they then take a percentage of the offender's income. And an example would be like 1/1000th of their annual income, right? And they multiply that together. And so it could be your fine could be somewhere between 2 to 10,000 marks, right? And I'm using marks because Germany is where the day fine really has been used quite a bit. So to make it a little clearer, I created this example. Let's say I punch my neighbor in the face and I'm found guilty of assault. So the severity of the offense establishes the number of days, right? Sort of the base amount I have to pay. So in this case, let's say assault is 250 days. And if it was something else like walking on his lawn, right, trespassing or something like that, maybe that would be 5 days. So the severity of the offense establishes the number of days. Then the actual amount I pay is based on my income, my ability to pay. So that would be 1/1000th, right, or 1/10 of 1% of my income. So let's say my salary is $30,000 a year. I punch my neighbor in the face. I get assault, which is 250 days. So 1/10 of 1%, it times 30,000 comes out to $30 a day. And so for 250 days worth of an offense, my fine for assault is $7,500. So, and it's not that I pay $30 every single day. That's just my fine is $7,500. It's based on the number of days is simply a way to measure the severity of the offense. If I made $50,000 a year, right, I'd still have the same number of days because assault gets 250 days, but I would multiply that times $50 a day, which would be 1/10 of 1%. So if I made $50,000 a year, I would pay a $12,000 fine, $12,500. So if two different people, both on the same day, punch their neighbor in the face, they're both found guilty of assault, they could pay different fines based on how much money they made. And so the wealthier people would pay a higher fine and the poorer people would pay a lower fine because ultimately it's equal in terms of the percentage of your income, right? So you'd feel the pain kind of in the same amount. So if I just spit on his mailbox, the fine might only be 50 days, right? So you have those two different things that will affect what my fine is going to be. How serious the offense is, that'd be the number of days, and then how much money I make. And then that would be the fine part of the day fine. So they're really common in Sweden and Germany. They're also used in some other places. They're not used in the United States, although they were trialed. They piloted some day fines, and they actually were quite successful. But we still don't use them. In Germany, 80% of all criminal and traffic offenses are resolved through day fines. And one of the reasons why they adopted this was to reduce incarceration, right? To reduce the number of people in their prisons. So in 1968 was the year before they adopted day fines. They had sentenced 184,000 people to prison. 20 years later, right, in 1988, there were just 48,000 sentences to prison. So between 1968 and 1988, you saw a substantial drop in the number of people sentenced to prison from 184,000 to 48,000. Right. Meanwhile, you see the population of Germany is growing, but also the actual number of criminal convictions also is growing. So they went from 573,000 criminal convictions in 1968 to over 600,000 in 1988. But yet they saw a substantial drop in sentences to prison because instead of sentencing to prison, they were giving people day fines. And so from their perspective, that's sort of win-win. You're saving on not sending people to prison, which in America can cost between $30,000 to $60,000 a year per person to send them to prison. And then on the flip side, not only are you not spending money on incarceration, you're making money through the day fines. right? So for these jurisdictions, they really consider it a win-win. The people don't really pose a big threat to the community. They don't need to be locked up, so we don't need to spend all that money. And in turn, they definitely are getting punished. They have to pay these substantial fines, which then also help fund the criminal justice system. So that's also how, if I can get this to work, that's also how you see some crazy speeding tickets. So you can see this on the website if you were to, like, I don't know, I guess you could just Google like day fine or high speeding tickets, and you see these crazy examples. So here we go. This is a good one. $58,000 for the fin going 15 miles an hour or over. If you are wondering what this massive spike from Finland is all about, note the Finns and several other EU countries, as you'll see, adjust speeding ticket fees based on the driver's annual income. So what that means is that's a day fine. So I don't know how you say that name, Rima Quisla, for example, he was caught doing 15 miles an hour in a 50-mile-an-hour zone, but he makes $7 million a year, which made his speeding ticket $60,000, almost $60,000. So on the one hand, you say, "Oh my God, $60,000 for speeding, that's insane." On the other hand, to give somebody who makes $7 million a year $100 fine, that's less than what that guy would tip for dinner that night, right? And so he wouldn't feel that at all. That would not be punitive. Whereas somebody making $20,000 a year, that $100 fine would be exceptionally punitive. $7 million a year, it wouldn't be at all. And so you can see these other examples of it. But basically, the idea is it's actually more fair than a tariff system, because it's based on, and it should be, right, we should all be punished the same, we should all feel the same punishment, and some people are simply not going to feel $100 fine as punishing as somebody else. So that's the argument for it. So a couple of courts, as I mentioned, a couple of courts in the US tried day fines, and actually they piloted it, and it actually worked really well. Like, they saw really good results. Nevertheless, they have not caught on in America. So I want you to think about, well, what are some strengths to day fines? And what are some downsides to it, some weaknesses? And why do you think it's not caught on in the US? And do you think we should have day fines? I'm going to talk a little bit about parole, which is separate from probation in a number of ways. So probation is run by the courts, and it is a punishment in lieu of incarceration. So it would go along with those other intermediate sanctions. Usually those intermediate sanctions are handled through probation. And probation is run by the courts. So sometimes it'll be the county court. In some places, some states, it's run by the Administrative Office of Courts, which is a state office, but it's the courts that run probation. Parole is run by the Department of Corrections, and it's considered an early release, right? So you go up for parole, and it's called an indeterminate sentencing because you may or may not get it. And so you may get out of prison early or you may not. And it's based on the perceptions of a parole board and whether or not they feel that you've been rehabilitated, whether or not they feel that you're prepared to leave prison early. On the other hand, it's not really early release because you're still very much serving your prison sentence. You're just doing it outside of prison. So you're still under the complete jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, who runs parole. You're just serving out the last bit of your sentence in your home, in the community. So there's two founding fathers of parole. Alexander McConaughey is the first guy, and he was a naval officer, and he became the superintendent of Norfolk Penal Colony, which was a little island off of Australia. And this is where, if you were a convict that got transported to Australia, right, that's sort of your phase one. And if you started screwing up on Australia, you would go to the Norfolk Penal Colony as your punishment. And it was a horrible place, as you might imagine. And so he felt, though, that the convict should be able to get their way back to Australia through good behavior and hard labor. So originally, if you were kicked off Australia and sent to the penal colony, that was it. And so there was no real motivation for you to pull it together. And so you have the worst of the worst of the worst going to this island with no incentive structure to keep your behavior in check. So he felt that, hey, maybe if you gave them the opportunity to earn their way back to the main island through hard work and good behavior, they would improve their behavior. So he set up the marks system. And this was a system that of levels that you could pass through by earning credits, right? Earning marks toward getting sent back to Australia. So it's, if you did a certain number of weeks or months doing good work, you could earn a certain number of marks. And eventually, after a certain number of marks, you could earn your way back to Australia. And then they would get their ticket of leave, right? So then you could leave and go back to the main island. And this is sort of the first example of indeterminate sentencing. And it worked. The conditions at Norfolk Penal Colony got a lot better. So these convicts who were on this island, they had this incentive system to improve their behavior and to be better. And so they were, a lot of them were. And so they would earn this ticket of leave and they could earn their way off the penal colony back to the other penal colony that was Australia. And so he was fired. He was fired for mollycoddling inmates. People felt, or not really inmates, convicts. People felt like he was too easy on them by improving the conditions of this island. And then you have Sir Walter Crofton. So in 1850, he was put in charge of the Irish prison system, which was really suffering from serious overcrowding. And he did not think McConaughey was a mollycoddler. He thought McConaughey was, in fact, a visionary. And so he liked that idea. So he took McConaughey's idea of this marks system to earn tickets of leave, and he set up a similar process in which inmates could earn early release from prison as a way to overcome the overcrowding problem. And so when a prisoner then was discharged, he was granted conditional liberty. And that meant that he could go out and he could be free, but if he screwed up, he would have to go back to prison. And of course, there was no parole at this point. This was the beginning of that. And so a police officer was sort of what we would consider the parole officer. And so he would generally be aware of who these prisoners are who were being released into the community early. And he would be assigned to maintain surveillance of them. And then he would recommend return to prison if the released inmate failed to follow the conditions of his release. So the original parole officers in Ireland were in fact just police officers. In the same way, the original probation officers in America were actually volunteers until eventually they set up actual professional probation offices. So from there, parole took off, and places, jurisdictions all over America and in Europe had indeterminate sentencing. And indeterminate sentencing is basically you don't have an end point, a hard fixed end point of your sentence. You can earn early release by demonstrating that you are rehabilitated. The argument is once somebody has rehabilitated, there's no point in keeping them in prison anymore, right? The point of prison is to keep them there until they're no longer a threat to themselves or others. And so once they've demonstrated they're no longer a threat to others, there's no point in spending the money to incarcerate them. And so parole was implemented everywhere in all the states in the US. But then by the 60s and 70s, people really started to question the value of indeterminate sentencing. And like so many things that have happened in corrections where good ideas have gotten derailed, there was another convergence of both. The right wing and the left wing started to hate parole specifically and indeterminate sentencing generally. So on the left, there was growing concern over unequal justice. So there was research and a big report by the Quakers, the American Friends Committee, that found that African Americans were much less likely to get parole than white inmates, even controlling for the offense type and institutional history. So there was evidence that, in fact, there was, as in so many aspects of corrections, there was a racial bias, and they were right. And on the right, there was a growing concern over coddling of criminals, and that they just weren't serving long enough sentences, that they were getting out too early. You could walk the walk and talk the talk and get out really early. And they were right. So you had these two problems. You had one, that these parole boards were really not very good at predicting who was uh, rehabilitated and who wasn't, and they would tend to then, their personal biases would then result in racial bias. So that was happening. But on the other hand, overall, parole had really severely reduced the length of time some inmates were serving in prison. So some were just getting out very, very early. Then you had the Martinson report, where Martinson and colleagues looked at over 300, they were juvenile programs, but looked at all these correctional programs and the research behind them, and concluded that there's no strong evidence that we actually know how to rehabilitate offenders. And so it kind of became known as the Nothing Works report. But really, the most accurate way to think of that report is their conclusion was that the research isn't good enough to demonstrate that anything works. So it's not that the research found nothing works. It's more like the research failed to find that things did work. And one of the big problems with correctional research is lack of a good control group, right? So that's why everybody, like every program, educational program, is associated with improvements. People who take any kind of educational program whatsoever are less likely to recidivate than those who don't. Well, very few of those studies at all use randomized assignment to education and non-education. So you have this real problem with self-selection. Anybody who signs up for a class is, by definition, already way ahead of anybody who refuses to sign up for a class. So anyways, really the problem with those programs and the research on them was the research just wasn't rigorous enough to demonstrate that anything worked. But since you already had this movement, again, on the left and the right, of everybody sort of questioning the value of parole and of indeterminate sentencing, everybody globbed onto this report and said, yes, nothing works. We don't know how to rehabilitate. And so that we shouldn't be using parole, which is biased, and we shouldn't be using parole, which is releasing people early when it's not clear they're actually being rehabilitated. It's worth mentioning Martinson later recanted on that and said, no, there is evidence that some things works, and he actually ended up killing himself. Then you also had the Supreme Court decision in 1967 in In re Gall, which was about the juvenile court system. So the first juvenile court system was at the turn of the last century in Chicago. And of course, that system was set up to where it was parens patriae, that is, the government was the parent for the juvenile in the court system. And with this model, the argument was, hey, we're doing this, right? This isn't to punish these juveniles. We're doing this to help these juveniles. And so when you're doing things to help juveniles, you don't need all this due process that we give the adults, because we're not punishing them. And so you had this whole juvenile court system that had very few, if any, due process protections for these kids. Because again, it's like, oh, well, we're doing this for their own good. Well, the problem is it was in fact punitive, right? The whole process was punitive. It was definitely perceived as punitive by the kids. And so in 1967, in this In re Gall decision, they said, look, you have to have due process. So nowadays, the juvenile court system is very much like the adult court system in terms of various due process rights. But this kind of undermined that. And again, the argument was, well, you don't need these due process rights because we're doing this for you, which, is again the whole base of this rehabilitative model of indeterminate sentencing. And to this day, there are still concerns whether or not coerced treatment even works. So this is, treatment within prisons, treatment where, well, you can't get out of prison until you've successfully followed these criteria for whatever treatment program you're in. And a lot of people argue, well, no, treatment really only works if the individual wants treatment rather than the individual being forced to engage in treatment. So there's some discussion of that. Other people think, no, that works great. Forcing them to get into treatment at least gets them into treatment. So a lot of states abolished parole in the late 20th century, in the 70s. And the federal government got rid of it. So BOP does not have parole. They do have supervised release. So when you get sentenced in the federal courts to prison, to federal prison, you can't get parole. There's no parole any longer, but you will usually get an additional like 2 years of supervised release. And so that's kind of like parole, except it's overseen by the federal probation because there is no federal parole. So you have a federal probation who, again, they'll just watch normal federal probationers. And that's who we got at our federal halfway house. We'd sometimes get the ones who were screwing up before they go back to prison. They'd have to come to our facility. They also then would oversee people coming out of prison as part of their supervised release. So there's a lot of, as with everything, private prisons, everything, prison industry, everything else, there are some good points and some bad points to indeterminate sentencing or parole. And ultimately, I fall on the side in favor of indeterminate sentencing and parole. And it's a shame they sort of to me, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. So just because there were problems with parole, really to me says that, well, you could reform parole, but instead a lot of places just eliminated it. So these are the pros and cons according to the National Institute of Justice. One is, a pro is that it's sentencing as a human process, right? You're not just sentencing, hey, this crime gets exactly this number of days in prison, but you're recognizing that it's a human with a backstory and different opportunities for growth and change, and you're sentencing based on that individual and the crime that that individual committed, but you're also including the fact that there is this individual human. So rehabilitation is the goal, right? So indeterminate sentencing is saying, hey, our whole point of locking you up is to rehabilitate you so you don't commit another offense. And once that's happened, we will let you out. And so the argument is, well, it incentivizes the offender to participate in treatment. And also it recognizes treatment, it places it front and center as the goal of corrections. And that's why we call it corrections. We're trying to correct that behavior. Whereas determinate sentencing, it's like, well, this is what it gets. This robbery gets X many years, X many months in prison, and that's that, regardless of whether or not you're rehabilitated. Similarly, then, public safety is a goal. One thing to keep in mind, when people get released without parole now, they're basically being released with no supervision. So parole, you may get out a little bit early, but more importantly, you're getting out and there is somebody there from the criminal justice system, from corrections, who supervises you and makes sure you're doing what you're supposed to do and sets up all these responsibilities that you have to meet while you're on parole. And when people are just released straight from prison with no parole, no supervision, there's none of that. The delegation of authority. So this is one of the foundations of our democracy, is this checks and balances, and you have the legislative and the executive branches, and the argument is, and the judicial, and the argument is that this it spreads the authority for deciding when somebody gets out. And when you don't have indeterminate sentencing, it's all based entirely on the legislative. They make those decisions. But once you have this option for indeterminate sentencing and parole, it gives it some of that authority to the judicial. It also gives authority to the corrections professionals. So, and that leads to this idea of professionalization. Well, who better to decide when somebody should get out? An elected politician or the people running the prison? And the people running the Department of Corrections. And so if you acknowledge and accept corrections as a professional field, then you should sort of by definition then accept that they are the best ones situated to decide when someone should get out, and that elected politicians, the legislative branch, is not in a position to do that. Also, it insulates decisions from public emotions. So the public, right, if you look at the fact that, well, everybody loved parole for a while, then everybody hated parole, and all these other things, that's not the best way to go about correctional policy, is based on the changing politics and the changing sentiments of the public. So the argument is that with this professionalization, it takes it out of that, because again, you have elected officials making those decisions, and if people get all up in arms about one particular crime for a while, then suddenly you have sentences based on that rather than based on this sort of more professional, arguably objective and empirically based approach to, well, when is in fact the best time to release? What are the best sentences for these people? How do we best decide whether or not somebody who's been rehabilitated? And then it's also efficient. So you remember Crofton, one of the main reasons why he started what became sort of the model of parole was to get people out of prison because they were so overcrowded. So it allows prisons to then have a little more authority over how many people to release, whom to release, based on other kinds of needs too, such as administrative needs. Well, we have this many people beyond our capacity. Hey, what if we let out these nonviolent elderly folks? Maybe that can improve things. On the other hand, there's a lot of cons too. Foremost, one of the reasons why they got rid of indeterminate sentencing and parole is the disparities. There's disparities in the death penalty, there's disparities in the arrest and incarceration for drug offenses, there's disparities at almost every step in the criminal justice system, and indeterminate sentencing is no different. The left was absolutely right that there was racial bias in how parole was being implemented. So inadequate implementation, it's really expensive to implement parole, good to do it well. And so it's never really been done. And arguably it's not necessarily possible to do it to a full adequate amount. And so if you can't fully surveillance and supervise them in the community, then it's best not to do it, right? You don't want inadequate implementation of letting people out of prison early. You want to either have the resources and the ability to do that, or you don't want to do it. Also, of course, rather than rehabilitation, there's all these reasons why we punish people. And one is, well, you get punished because you deserve to be punished. And so regardless of whether or not you can walk the walk and talk the talk after a certain number of years in prison and treatment, the argument is, well, you still are being punished because you deserve to be punished, regardless of what your future behavior is. And so you don't get to get out a year and a half early simply because you successfully completed all these treatment modalities. Another one is the public. Obviously, we got rid of it in a lot of states. And so there's definitely a public sentiment that is leery of indeterminate sentencing. And just like with the death penalty, whether you agree with it or not, you go with the majority. And the majority currently really still is quite suspicious of parole and indeterminate sentencing. And then again, we don't really know how effective most treatment is. We're still not very good. So, people are always talking about, well, we should just focus on rehabilitation. That always implies we actually know how to rehabilitate. But remember, over 2/3 of offenders return to prison. There's a whole lot of evidence we don't know how to rehabilitate. And so simply letting people out early because they've gone through some programs and they've managed to talk this talk of treatment, there's not a whole lot of evidence that, in fact, these things are actually all that effective. So you can think of parole supervision in terms of two sort of oversimplified models. And that is, you have the law enforcement model versus the social work model. And the law enforcement model is generally individuals or an overall model that's focused on the rules, making sure that the parolee follows the rules, and making sure that the parolee is punished when they fail to follow the rules. The social work model then at the other end is the parole officer is there to be an advocate for the parolee, and if there is breaking of the rules, to try to help that parolee not to do it again and try to find services for the parolee. Ideally, the best parole officer is both of those things. And I can tell you that there are some who are very much in what is called the social work model. And this is not really to say anything about actual people in social work or law enforcement. These are really just these sort of extreme models of supervision. And I've seen plenty in both. And I can tell you the people at the far end of the law enforcement spectrum and the people at the far end of the social work spectrum generally often end up very unhappy in their jobs. And so a good parole officer and a good probation officer is really both of those things. So you're an advocate for the parolee, but at the same time, you do have to make sure those rules are being followed. You do have to make sure that there are sanctions in place, right, to deter future problems. And so ideally, a parole officer, the best parole officers, are a good, healthy blend of both of those approaches. And they don't over-identify with one of the two models. So a lot of people are saying that there has been this shift more towards the law enforcement model, that is towards stricter supervision and a tighter enforcement of conditions, what some people call tail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em. And part of that reason really, though, has nothing to do with this shift towards an attitude of being stricter. Some of it comes from just the way in which parole and probation and community corrections works generally, in this move towards evidence-based practices and accountability. And so the accountability model and evidence-based practices, you have to have outcomes. So that's where you have just this string of various outcomes that are sort of very objective, empirically based. How many drug tests did they take? How many drug tests were clean? How many times did they visit their parole officer? How much money do they make? How long did it take to get their job? How much money are they paying in victim restitution and court fees and all that? So that's where you end up with all these requirements of parole that can make parole hard, but it also provides all these measurements so that the taxpayers, the government, other individuals can make sure that the parole and the parolee are being held accountable, so that you can measure these different measures of success. And so when you have those empirical sort of measures that are sort of checkbox actuarial model of supervision, it ends up towards this stricter model without actually being a conscious decision towards that stricter model. That's just, I think, one of the side effects of going towards a more objective empirical model of supervision generally. So what Foster calls it the promulgation of thou shalt not lists, right? So you have those long lists of the requirements of parole, and some people say that's the reason why we have so much failure on parole, is because of all the requirements. That's also how we measure success. It also provides good objective measurements of success to have that. And if you remember from earlier discussions, those lists that you shall not do, it's not unreasonable, right? Thou shalt get a job. Thou shalt not use drugs. Thou shalt not live in a house with other convicted felons, etc. Like, these are not unreasonable lists, I don't think. So I'm going to talk briefly about caseload because it goes nicely to what I want to talk about, which is Horn's personal responsibility model. So think about caseload. So the average parole officer is going to work a 40-hour work week, right? A normal full-time work week. That's 160 hours a month. On average, the national average caseload is about 70 parolees per officer. It varies widely. It varies by jurisdiction. It varies by, as we'll talk about, by the parole officer, his or herself. But on average, there's about 70 parolees per officer. So when you break that up over the 160 hours per month, that comes out to, at most, a parole officer can spend less than 2.5 hours a month with any individual parolee, right? So that's just if all they did was just one after another saw them. They could see them for just over 2 hours a month, which should be, half an hour a week. But that assumes no paperwork, right? They're not actually spending a lot of their time, and that is a lot of their time is doing paperwork. They're having to go to court for revocation hearings, actually taking days off. And then you also have them, they have to travel. They usually will have to travel to the workplace to ensure that the parolees are there. Maybe travel to the parolee's home, make sure that's okay, right? Sometimes checking for contraband and whatnot. So obviously, even the 2.3 hours a month is not realistic. So they can't even spend a half an hour a week with a parolee. So you're literally looking at considerably less than 30 minutes a week for a parolee. So that really raises this question: is that enough time? Is, say, 20 minutes a week with a recently released felon, is that enough time to do either goal of parole, which is to protect the public through supervision, or change parolee behavior? And I think that's a good question. And I think a lot of people would answer, well, yes and no. It is and it isn't. And this isn't how parole works. There isn't an average amount of time that a parolee sees someone. So if you really think in terms of, there are high needs parolees and low needs parolees, and maybe the low need parolee only sees an officer 30 minutes every other week, right? So maybe 20 minutes or maybe a half an hour a month. And these are the people who are very low risk uh, of anything, of failure, of committing another offense. And so they're probably going to do well regardless. And then you have others who are very sort of high risk and they need more intensive case management. And so they might actually be seeing the parole officer 30 minutes a week, maybe an hour coming in a lot more often. And so you have to think in terms of, well, it's not that on average a parolee just sees their parole officer 15, 20 minutes a week. You have to think, well, that's an average, but you have some who are seeing them less because arguably they don't need to see the parole officer anymore. And you have others that are seeing them considerably more because they do. But that question raises an interesting proposal from Martin Horn. And he was the director of parole for New York and for Pennsylvania. And he came up with what he calls the personal responsibility model. And he says, first of all, just abolish parole. We don't need parole. And remember, he was the director of parole for these two different states. So his model says, get rid of parole. And instead of parole, you have what really is kind of similar to what I just said the Bureau of Prisons has, where it's really sort of a supervised release, except there's no real supervision. So you create this legally diminished liberty status for a fixed period of time following release from prison. And you don't get it it's not indeterminate. You don't have a parole board or some sort of board deciding what it should be as you're coming out of prison based on your behavior in prison. It's part of your sentence. So the judge gives it to you at the time you're sentenced to prison. You get, 8 years in prison plus 2 years of this diminished liberty status when you're released. And what that really means is you're not being overseen by anybody because there is no parole. What it means is instead, if you are convicted of a new crime during this 2-year period, there are additional sentence enhancements. So it's kind of like these other sentence enhancements where if you commit a felony with a gun or something like that, there's an automatic 5 years tacked onto your sentence, that kind of thing. So it'd be the same sort of thing where during this 2 years of post-release from prison, if you get convicted of a new felony, you will then have this extra sentence enhancement, say 5 years tacked onto your sentence. So that's your punishment, right? That's the threat. When you have the carrot and the stick, that's the stick to keep you in line. But then there's also a carrot. So in return for this, each offender is given a voucher, say a $2,000 voucher. It's kind of like food stamps where they get the voucher and then it's not money per se because they can only spend it at approved vendors, approved service providers. So I get my $2,000 voucher and then I can go and spend it on certain types of services. So maybe I could go spend it on drug treatment. So I could go and find a drug treatment facility I want to go to, and I've got $2,000 worth, and I give them my voucher, right? I don't have the money. I just give them a voucher, and then they take that voucher, they submit it to the state, and the state reimburses them for whatever the cost of treatment is. So I, as an offender, could just not do anything. I just get this $2,000 coupon. I just throw it away. It doesn't cost the state anything if I throw it away because it's just a coupon. Or I can say, well, I'm going to go to community college, or I'm going to go take some classes and get certified in asbestos removal. I'm going to do some job training thing. So I, as the offender, now have more autonomy over deciding what it is I think I need to succeed rather than what some law thinks I need or a parole officer thinks I need, right? Rather than forcing me to go to AA or NA. Maybe that's not how I want to spend my $2,000 voucher. I'd rather go and get a degree or get certified for employment. So it gives me a certain amount of autonomy and a certain amount of support, this $2,000, to help me get the services I think I need, right? And so then it really puts the responsibility on the releasee, the person who just got out of prison. They have to make that decision of whether or not to avail themselves of these services. They get to make that decision as to what services, right? And not everything. There are only services that have been approved by the state. And then it's their responsibility, the releasee's responsibility, to not break the law, and that there's no need for a parole officer in all of this. You're just giving it to the offender to pull it together, and you're giving them resources, right? You're giving them this voucher, and you're also giving them personal responsibility and autonomy to make the decisions that they think how they could best use that money to succeed when they're released. So when he makes this argument, he uses in his example, he used New York for his example, and he said, look, right at the time that he wrote this, he said, look, New York spends $190 million, right, every year to parole 60,000 releasees. So he says, on average, that costs about almost $3,200 a year per parolee. And so he says, instead, you just get rid of parole and you reserve a $2,000 voucher for each parolee. So right there, you're sort of, instead of spending the $3,200 a year, you're just spending $2,000 a year because there's no parole. You're just giving them each a $2,000 voucher. And again, it's not $2,000. It's just a voucher, kind of like school, right? School, what are those called? School waivers. So he says, assuming, say, 25,000 annual releases every year, this would cost about $50 million. So he says, even with, say, $10 million in overhead, because you got to have overhead, you got to have people approving the vendors, approving where the money can be spent and where it cannot be spent, and then actually reimbursing, because again, it's just vouchers, so reimbursing the vendors, the organizations, the service providers for their vouchers. They said that even with that, it's still $130 million saved annually. And he says, instead of spending all that money on parole on the back end, instead you invest that money on the front end and put that money into like Head Start programs, right? That you stop these kids and individuals from going down the path to begin with. So he says, spend all that money on police, on teen pregnancy prevention, on programs like Head Start, things that really help start to reduce crime generally. So it's an interesting model, I think, that puts the responsibility on the offender, provides them with a certain amount of resources and support, but gives them both the responsibility and the opportunity to choose what they want to do, and then the responsibility for actually following through. And then it can save really quite a bit of money.